we used to have heat-seeking missiles, right, that would chase
yeah.
jets. Well, those are day Class A now because, you know, the Israelis discovered how to set very hot flares behind the jets, and so the missiles would go off.
Right.
So now when missiles want to follow a jet, they have a very small smog tester up in the nose, and they follow the exhaust right up into the engine. So the U.S. military is now engineering tanks for alcohol on the jet engine so that when they know a missile's following them, they switch to alcohol, the emissions disappear, and the missile's confused.
This is Peak Moment. We are living at a peak of human innovation, information, wealth, and health. But we're also at a peak of population and consumption, with rising temperatures and declining resources fueled by cheap oil and gas. Peak Moment Television, bringing you examples of positive responses to energy decline and climate change through local community action.
Hi, welcome to Peak Moment. I'm Janaea Donaldson. I'm in the town of Santa Cruz on the coast of California at the Bookshop Santa Cruz, where people have been reading and getting enlightened for decades. I'm here with the author of a wonderful book you're going to want to read, David Blume. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Janaea.
David's the author of a book called Alcohol Can Be a Gas, and he's also the founder of the, tell me.
International Institute for Ecological Agriculture.
So here we are. Alcohol can be a gas. You've been looking at this for decades.
Yes, I first got involved in alcohol fuel back when I was in San Francisco State University, and I had a professor, Doc Sweeney, who used to pull the students' legs pretty often. So he said to us one day when there was a bottle of fermenting beer on the table, that stuff would run your car. And I looked at him and said, you're lying to us this time. And when I went to the library, what I discovered was an enormous history of alcohol running vehicles that I had no idea even existed.
He wasn't pulling your leg.
No, not at all. In fact, alcohol was the first auto fuel before gasoline was ever invented.
Really?
Yeah, gasoline came later. The internal combustion engine came first. So basically, you could get alcohol at any farm in the United States because they all had distilleries. And it wasn't until much later that gasoline became very common in the cities as a byproduct of the fledgling oil industry at the time, which was really in the business of heating and lighting homes, replacing whale oil and lard and that kind of thing.
Okay.
And the stuff that was too volatile for oil lamps that would make them explode, well, Rockefeller flushed that into the rivers at night. And that's the stuff we nowadays call gasoline. It was the toxic waste of the oil business.
Right.
And today, gasoline is still the toxic waste of the oil business. We're paying to dispose of big oil's toxic residues.
Ooh.
Yes, no 2 days in a row is gasoline ever alike. It's whatever's left over for making more valuable things from oil.
So here we are burning the planet's atmosphere with stuff that's the waste.
Totally the waste of the oil industry.
So why didn't we, so if we were using alcohol for internal combustion machines, how come, is it just because, why aren't we doing that now?
Well, it was an interesting battle in the early part of the 1900s, who was going to be the dominant fuel in it. And Henry Ford thought alcohol should be, because as Henry Ford used to say, if we can't be the farmer's customer, how can he be ours? And of course, alcohol was made from farm products. Sure. Rockefeller had a different opinion about this, and they tussled over this quite a bit. And finally, Rockefeller decided to stop playing fair. So what he did is he funded a splinter group of crazy old ladies called the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, and he gave them $4 million in 1915. And with $4 million, you can very easily buy Congress at that time, and that's what happened. And what we got was a piece of legislation that was not a simple bill that just passed by a vote. It was a constitutional amendment called the Volstead Act, otherwise known as Prohibition. So alcohol was taken off the market, not just as a beverage, but as for any use. And for 16 years, Rockefeller had competition-free access to the market, and gasoline became entrenched as our motor fuel, even though it never was the preferred fuel.
Wow. So obviously alcohol with peak oil, which, you've been paying attention to for several decades, with that being imminent here, or at least rather soon, people are talking about biodiesel and ethanol and other several alternatives, but those are the two hottest. You hear more about biodiesel. Why aren't we hearing about ethanol?
Well, it's very interesting. Biodiesel, I ran my first tractor on biodiesel back in 1978. And the thing about biodiesel versus ethanol in terms of why one is getting attention, not the other, is that biodiesel does not have any effect whatsoever on oil companies. If we took all the oil that we currently get from plants, from corn, from soybeans, from whatever, we would only replace 2% of the diesel fuel that we currently use. So it's not a threat to the oil companies.
Let me think. 2%, if we use all of those plants instead of for food?
All that vegetable oil, yes. You got to realize that plants are very good at making carbohydrates. They take carbon dioxide from the air and water, so carbon, hydrogen, carbohydrates, mix it with solar energy, and plants start off by making sugar from these things.
Okay.
Sugar gets built up into other things in the plant. For instance, it can be made into starch, which is 35 sugars together. Or thousands of sugars in a chain make cellulose. But a little more complex chemistry takes that sugar and makes it into vegetable oil. But it's an energy-intensive process for the plant.
Okay.
So an acre of soybeans will only produce about 48 gallons of biodiesel. Very low yield.
Okay.
When it comes to alcohol, though, plants make sugar and starch really well. And we can be looking at yields as low as 300 gallons an acre for corn to maybe 10,000 gallons an acre for cattails grown in sewage. So the ability for plants to turn that sunlight into chemical energy is much greater when we're looking for sugar and not oil.
So when you're talking about gallons of alcohol made from the sugars, from the plants, all the way the cattails, versus the oils that can be made. So give me the numbers again. How much for the oils?
Well,
maybe?
biodiesel down around 48 gallons
and
from soybeans.
Here, 300 to 10,000.
Yes.
If we're doing alcohols.
The one exception with biodiesel is African nut palms, which are grown in large plantations around the tropics, and they can yield about 500 gallons per acre. And it's very interesting how we came to have palm oil as, in such profusion as we have it today. When Dr. Diesel first invented the diesel engine, he cast about for what would be the best crop and totally settled on the African nut palm as the best way to go because there was such a good yield per acre. So we went around the world encouraging the tropical countries to grow these African nut palms, but they take a long time to grow, and 10 years before you see your first fuel. So during that time, Rockefeller figured out how to make synthetic diesel fuel out of petroleum, since the original diesel fuel was vegetable oil. And by the time palm oil was ready to come on the market, so petroleum diesel had overwhelmed the market, and so there was nowhere to sell the palm oil. So the palm oil was laying around unsold, and so they decided to start selling it for food. And so we ate palm oil for 40 or 50 years until doctors finally said, "Oh my God, this stuff isn't food. You can't use this.
It's not good for your heart."
Well, that's what happens when you drink diesel fuel. It's just bad stuff.
So I want to go back to that comparison. Other than the palm oil, is that same field that gives us much less yield in oils than in alcohol and sugars? Can you give me the difference in the energy equivalents that you get out of those two?
Well, that's a complex equation. In theory, diesel engines extract more energy from a fuel than a gasoline engine.
So they're more efficient.
They would seem to be more efficient because you can compress the diesel fuel to a much higher pressure before it explodes. And the more you can compress a fuel before it explodes, the more energy you get out of it.
Okay.
Now, with gasoline, you're only looking at about a 20% efficiency of turning chemical energy into work. The rest of that energy goes off as waste heat primarily. With diesel, you can do better than 30%. Now, with alcohol, we have quite a different equation. It's not a fair equation to compare alcohol to gasoline. It has many different qualities. So alcohol has a very high octane rating. It's 105 octane. So the higher your octane, the more you can compress a fuel before it will explode on its own. So gasoline, if you compress it too much, it pings or it pre-detonates, where alcohol won't do that. And that's why they use it in race cars. Now, the DOE has done some very good experiments using alcohol in a modified diesel engine, and they were able to actually get 22% better mileage per gallon on alcohol than diesel fuel. So alcohol is actually 45% thermally efficient compared to gasoline's 20%, and diesel is approximately 30%.
Okay.
So although alcohol starts off with less energy per pound, it uses it so much more efficiently that we get more miles per gallon in an ideally designed alcohol engine. If we just use alcohol in a gasoline engine and convert it to run on alcohol,
Which I want to ask about, but go ahead.
and we'll get there, you might lose about 10 or 12% miles per gallon.
So you get less miles per gallon if alcohol than gasoline.
Yes, you would typically lose 10 or 12% miles per gallon in a gasoline engine not optimized to use the alcohol.
Okay.
So if we just convert a gasoline engine to run on alcohol, you do lose a little mileage.
All right. Okay. But then you get, okay. What does it take to convert a vehicle, and what would you do to make it optimized? What would that take?
Well, we would want to take advantage of alcohol's qualities, like its very high octane rating. The 105 octane rating of alcohol allows you to compress the fuel to a much, as I was mentioning with diesel engines. So we'd want to do that, of course. And so, for instance, the Saab company in Sweden has a flexible fuel engine that tries to optimize as much as it can for gasoline and for alcohol, so it can run on both.
So, and the mixture of both?
Or any mixture of the two.
Okay, alrighty.
And so in that case, to approach the optimum conditions for alcohol, it has a turbocharger which compresses the air going into the engine. And so for alcohol, it compresses the engine a lot more than it does when it's going for gasoline. As a result, the mileage on alcohol goes up when the turbocharger kicks in, of course the mileage goes down for gasoline when the pressure goes down. So in that case, the Saab 9.5 gets about equal mileage on alcohol or on gasoline because the engine can try to optimize more for each fuel.
Right.
But if we build dedicated alcohol vehicles, and the first vehicle of that kind will be coming off the assembly line very soon, also from Saab, is a 400 horsepower sports car, which will only run on alcohol because Sweden has a whole national alcohol distribution system.
Aha, okay.
So that vehicle will get very high efficiency, very good mileage, and tremendous horsepower from an engine half the size of the gasoline engine.
Truly. So you're putting in fewer resources to build the engine.
Absolutely.
And less weight to have to push down the road.
All of that. And if you look at the embedded energy that goes into building an engine, it's tremendous. And another aspect of alcohol has a real bearing on this. Alcohol burns so clean, which is good for our environment, and we'll talk about that,
right.
that it leaves no carbon in the engine at all. Your oil never changes color when you run on alcohol. No black soot is in your oil. Now that black soot that is a byproduct of burning gasoline is like microscopic sandpaper, and it goes ahead and wears out the rings on the inside of the car. Okay. So when you run on alcohol, your engine lasts 3 times as long as it does on gasoline. And that's a tremendous energy savings in itself.
So you don't have to build as many engines.
That's right.
I mean, why don't we have alcohol engines? Well, I understood from the Rockefeller scene why we don't have that. But it would seem to me that this time was people are being, as the oil declines, well, of course, the oil companies are still in power here. We should be pushing ahead to do ethanol. And could we? I mean, is that feasible on the ecological scale? I mean, we're looking here at growing, of replacing food crops with fuel, or can we use non-food? I mean, what do we build from?
Well, the food versus fuel myth is something that, in fact, that term food versus fuel was coined by the American Petroleum Institute in 1979.
Oh, thank you very much.
They created this myth that's out there that somehow alcohol is going to compete with food, and therefore wouldn't it be immoral to feed our SUVs our corn than the starving hordes of Africa?
Yes, yes.
There are multiple levels why this isn't true. First of all, nobody in Africa buys our corn because it's genetically modified and it's considered not fit for human consumption. So there's only 4 countries in the world that will even bother to buy U.S. corn, and none of them are in Africa. So we're not feeding the hordes of the world with our corn. But what do we feed our corn to?
Okay.
Well, you didn't eat any corn today, most likely, unless you bought some candy, because most of our corn that we use for human use in the United States is high fructose corn sweetener.
And a whole lot of other things besides candy. I mean, our supermarkets are full of
corn sweetener.
Corn sweeteners.
So about 8% of our corn goes into corn sweetener. About 3% goes into breakfast cereal, like corn flakes or whatever. And I would argue that neither of those things are really food. And 1% of the alcohol goes to make whiskey, which I might argue is food, but you might disagree with me. So we're still down to single digits. We're not even up to 10% of our corn goes into things that people eat. Now, you might argue that meat is food, and so if we feed cattle the corn, it is still food. Now, the interesting thing, my background is an ecological biologist and as a permaculture designer, and as such, we always go to the source of things. So we go look at where cattle came from originally, which were not the grasslands of the world, but the forests of southern Europe and northern Africa.
Forests?
That's right. If you take a look at a cattle's foot, they're big and wide for soft soils that they can walk on, not like a bison's feet that are good for punching into tough grassland for traction. These cattle evolved in places where there was no grass and no grass seed. And of course, corn is a grass and corn grain is grass seed. So as a result, cattle never evolved the digestive ability to use the starch. Most of the starch goes through a cow undigested. And starch is 3/4 of corn. So here's the interesting thing. If you take the corn and you first ferment it to make alcohol, we only use the starch. So all the protein and all the fat and all the other nutrients are still there in what we call the dried distiller's grains, or the byproduct. When you feed the byproduct to the cattle, instead of the original corn, they gain 17% more weight.
So it's healthier for them.
That's right. And
more efficient.
It's a paradigm shift. If you want to make more meat and have more food, you have to ferment the corn first and make alcohol to get the starch out of the way, and then you get more meat. If we kept the meat production stable, in other words, we didn't increase the meat production, so we'd be using less grain now, that 17% difference would feed the entire world with our corn. So, you know, the whole point of this is it's not food versus fuel. It's fuel so we can have more food. And so those are the basic, you know, rules of the game. But there are other crops other than corn that we can grow for making alcohol that still work for animal feed or for human food and produce more fuel per acre.
So you're really there's multiple efficiencies in here. Feeding animals, feeding people, feeding our alcohol for vehicles and other things. You know, you spoke about the myth about, food versus fuel is one of them. One of them is about, the other is about the energy return. I was trying to get to that and didn't say it very well, is like part of the numbers that are trotted out, and I want to hear what they are, is how much energy we put in to produce alcohol versus how much energy are we getting back out. And I've heard all over the map from we're not even making, you know, one energy input in to get one out, and to maybe a little bit. So where are we on that?
Well, and this is unfortunately a place where peak oil people have been taken in by the propaganda by the American Petroleum Institute. Several popular authors have quoted a primary source on this subject, David Pimentel, a fellow from Cornell University. And he's been to alcohol fuel what the six scientists that say global warming is only a theory to the climate debate. He's the one guy who the press will always quote for balance about alcohol, about saying it's a bad idea when everyone else says it's a good one. And what Pimentel has been famous for saying is, you know, producing alcohol is like taking 1.5 gallons of gasoline to only get back a gallon's worth of energy. Well, it turns out that in the scientific community, his opinion is completely negligible. It's, you know, laughed at. But in the press, powered by the American Petroleum Institute, everyone hears this, and everyone thinks this is true. The reality is there's a couple of issues here. We're asking about what do we do to replace petroleum? So one question would be how much petroleum goes into making alcohol for how much energy we get out, which is a slightly different question than how much overall energy goes in to get back out.
Okay.
So in the case of oil, only for every gallon of alcohol we produce, we use 1/6 of a gallon of oil. So
that's from the growing in what is from corn. Producing it from corn.
This is using corn, which is the worst energy crop to be comparing here. So we're using the worst case. Okay, so
worst case. All right.
So where does the rest of the energy come from? Because alcohol's energy gain in the United States is only about 30 to 70% more energy out than in, which is a modest gain. The rest of the energy comes from coal or natural gas. Now, these are not petroleum, but they are also not renewable. So they're not our preferred source, and they also add to climate change. So that's changing in the United States, but to illustrate how that change is happening, we need to look at the rest of the world when it comes to alcohol first. And most of the rest of the world uses sugarcane to make alcohol. So Brazil and India are the two leading countries making alcohol now, and how they do it is a model for us. In Brazil, they take the sugarcane. So the plant fiber that's left over after the crushing is then burned in boilers, which produces steam and it drives generators to provide all the electricity for the plant.
Okay.
And
okay.
the steam is used for the heat part of the plant as well. Now, in the case of Brazil, 3/4 of the electricity produced at the alcohol plant is put back into the grid. Only a small amount of the electricity is
It's
even
used
needed.
to run the plant.
That's right.
Oh, okay.
So in the case of Brazil, all of the energy used to make the alcohol is renewable because sugar cane bagasse is a carbohydrate, it's cellulose. It comes from solar energy, carbon dioxide, and water, just like the alcohol.
Okay.
So now our energy return for petroleum energy input, a little bit different equation,
Okay, got it.
is more like 100 to 1. In other words, 100 units out for every unit because so little petroleum energy is used in the production
It
of
was
alcohol.
probably just using the tractors or the whatever to get the sugar there or something.
And that's only temporary because we can run those on alcohol, of course.
So
And-
eventually all of the petroleum inputs could be replaced, or nearly all.
And, you know, one of the big things that Dr. Pimentel tries to point to are tires, because tires are made of a huge amount of oil.
Okay.
And it turns out that in World War II, when we were cut off of rubber from by Japan, we made synthetic rubber out of alcohol to be able to shoe our vehicles. And we can do that again today. It's actually getting to a point now where alcohol-sourced rubber for tires is cost competitive with petroleum-sourced rubber. So we don't even need to use petroleum for the tires.
This is very bad news
Now-
for the oil companies.
Oh,
Go
it's
ahead.
very bad news.
Go
Now,
ahead.
here's what's happening in the U.S., which coming back to how we can do
Yeah,
it here better.
yeah.
And this is a very simple system, and I would propose more complex and interesting systems. But right now, they're taking that dried distiller's grains after they make the alcohol. They're feeding cattle with it right on site.
Okay.
Then they take the manure from the cattle, are fermenting that into methane, which is
Okay.
natural gas.
Right,
You know,
right.
basically the way you would process sewage is the same idea.
Right.
And that natural gas is then used to run the alcohol plant, but there's a surplus of natural gas. So you actually put gas back into the gas network, and also you produce surplus electricity. So the first plants in the U.S. are now using this renewable system,
Interesting.
which is eliminating the use of oil.
Fabulous. The whole, I mean, I feel like you're sort of having to move this whole system into a different direction here that we're not even used to or thinking about. I mean, the agricultural system, our vehicles, our and other uses, you know, for energy generation and so on.
Well, and that's, as an ecologist, none of this intimidates me. And what, you know, I mean, thinking about whole systems is what we do as ecologists. Now, what's important to note is that as energy becomes tighter, the ecological way of designing systems becomes the most economic way of designing systems. And so suddenly, the way we look at things from a whole system point of view now makes sense to American
It's
business.
going to snap into place because
That's
of
right.
the economic efficiencies.
Right.
You're close to that. We're closer to that.
And we can be all the way there in less than 10 years. Every alcohol plant in the United States currently operating, and there's over 100, will certainly be running on renewable energy within the next 10 years because the price of natural subsidized gas has gotten to be so expensive that it's no longer cost effective compared to these ecological alternatives.
Well, of course, our natural gas supplies are decreasing, and it's
correct.
highly expensive to be importing this from tankers from across the world.
Well, and incredibly dangerous. Incredibly dangerous. You see, if you've seen the movie Syriana,
Yes.
there was a point
Yes.
at which the kids, the suicide bomber kids, have a missile on the front of their little
Their little
fishing
boat, right.
and they ram into not an oil tanker, but a liquid natural gas tanker.
That was LNG.
And they didn't show you what happened next, because what would happen next, according to the Federal Energy Management Administration, would be a blast zone of 10-mile radius. The city of New York has estimated that if the Staten Island LNG terminal blows up, a minimum of 100,000 people will be killed. And this particular natural gas terminal in New York is a tenth of the size that they're planning on building them. So you're talking about
Huge
enormous
disaster.
Potentials for disaster.
Security.
Yeah.
And instability. I mean, no thank you. No wonder we don't want them on our coast. Thank you.
Well, and in fact, the United States government is, as we speak, trying to pass a bill that will take local siting of LNG terminals out of state and local hands and only let the federal government preempt.
Scary.
So we could be in the same position we are with cell towers now, where your local community
Can't
can't
even
regulate
speak.
where those go.
Wow,
Only the federal
wow,
government.
that's scary. That is scary. In our last 2 minutes here, though we'll continue after this, I want to look at sort of the pollution side of things, if we can do that for just brief.
Well,
How does
good.
alcohol fit this?
I guess the first thing I'd like to say about pollution with alcohol is I'll start with a story. Gordon Cooper and I, an astronaut and a aeronautical engineer, back in the early 80s, and I were working on certifying a jet engine for alcohol. And we had the brand new pollution control testing, gauge that, wasn't really in wide use yet. It was a really good tool. And we stuck the probe in the exhaust of the jet engine running on alcohol, and none of the needles were moving. And we go, God, what's wrong with this thing? We're banging the box or hitting the thing on the table, nothing's working, right? And then I set it down in front of the engine. And the LA air going into the engine made all the needles jump. So the exhaust coming out of the jet engine was cleaner than the air going in.
No.
So I'll give you a corollary to that with our U.S. military. And we could talk more in detail about emissions in our upcoming discussion. But we used to have heat-seeking missiles, right, that would chase jets. Well, those are day Class A now because, the Israelis discovered how to set very hot flares behind the jets, and so the missiles would go off.
Right.
So now when missiles want to follow a jet, they have a very small smog tester up in the nose, and they follow the exhaust right up into the engine. So the U.S. military is now engineering tanks for alcohol on the jet engine so that when they know a missile's following them, they switch to alcohol, the emissions disappear, and the missile's confused.
Oh, I love it.
It's so clean.
Oh, my God.
So,
all right. This is to be continued. Those are great stories. And we'll continue more about alcohol and its myths and its truths and why aren't we there in just a bit. You're watching Peak Moment, Community Responses for a Changing Energy Future. I'm Janaea Donaldson. Please join us next time.